Okay, welcome from snowy Montana. It is cold here today. It is snowing. I thought I'd come on because I hear the question so often, why does God allow innocent children to suffer? And I was reading the Bible the other day and it made me think, well, there's the answer, Father. So, what does the Bible say about it? Said another way, we could say, do I pay for the sins of my parents? Right. So Jeremiah was a prophet in the Old Testament. And he also had this question of God. And he wrote in Jeremiah 31, um, you show love to thousands, but bring the punishment for the parents' sins into the laps of their children after them. So Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet. He was a prophet during the time of the southern kingdom in Judah in the Old Testament, right before Judah fell to Babylon. And I think most of us know Babylon. Babylon was not a good place, it was not godly. And they were led away then. Judah was led away and they were led into captivity. God had sent Jeremiah to warn them and tell them that they had this impending demise. But they didn't heed that warning. But Jeremiah, nonetheless, was a godly man, and it bothered him. And he was deeply moved when he watched what happened to his nation. And he wrote the book of Lamentations. And the book of Lamentations was really a poem where Jeremiah, this weeping prophet, expressed his deep pain and suffering to God. And here's a short piece from that poem in Lamentations that he wrote. And he said, my eyes fail from weeping. I am in torment within. My heart is poured out on the ground because my people are destroyed, because children and infants faint. They faint in the streets of the city. They say to their mothers, where is bread and wine? As they faint, like the wounded in the streets of the city, as their lives ebb away in their mother's arms. He was tormented by this. Unfortunately, children do often suffer for the actions of their parents, whether this is like crack babies or homes of incest that I came from or other forms of abuse. We pay for the choices of our parents, just in the same way that these children in Judah paid and that the prophet wrote about. They suffered for the nation's actions. And we also see that in countries like North Korea, where these children are suffering for the actions of other people. It's not the children's fault. So some insist, and I hear this a lot, that only no one but God could be ultimately responsible for such suffering. And perhaps those were the feelings behind Jeremiah's honest but bitter complaints. Yet, I got to tell you, God never wanted anyone to suffer, particularly children. And in Jeremiah's times, Judah herself could only be blamed, just like many times it is not the blame of the children, but the blame of the parents, and only they can blame themselves. So, in an imperfect world, through no fault of their own, children often suffer the consequences of others' actions. But those afflictions in this life do not necessarily mean punishment for an eternity. And there's a big difference there. So children are not eternally damned simply because they are born to ungodly parents. So the answer to the question is no, God does not allow or condone suffering in any capacity, and he does not allow or condone suffering of children. I would like to add that in that same passage, Jeremiah, in that book of Jeremiah, God also told Jeremiah some beautiful, beautiful words in the declaration he said to Jeremiah here. And many people are very familiar with Jeremiah chapter 29:11. And he says, God says to Jeremiah, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." So ultimately, just as God was giving Judah a choice in that day, he also always gives us choice. So once we leave our parents' home, the choice ultimately comes down to us, and our suffering can indeed end. I am a complete living example of that. I really don't suffer anymore, but I've also made choices that are vastly different from the choices that I came from, that my parents made. Not that my parents, or that not that my children didn't suffer for some of my choices, because clearly I've made wrong choices in life. But staying with God does not allow or condone suffering of children. And ultimately, the choice is ours for who we become. But to answer that question, no, he does not. Be blessed until next time.